What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Welcome to Week 16 Fantasy Football. For a lot of you guys, your fantasy championships. There's a lot on the line here in Week 16, and we need to knock it out of the park for the running back position. Now, we did pretty good Week 15. We'll get into those numbers here in just a second. But before we do, just another reminder, and I say this almost every week just to try to, stress the fact here that take the information provided in these videos to make your own decisions. These are your teams. We're just trying to supply perspective and information to make those decisions a little bit easier come game time. Don't get overly caught up with what column these guys are in. You're not going to get the information needed just by looking at what column they're in. There's so much more to these videos, and make sure you take that and apply it to your team. So now let's go back to Week 15 just last week and see how we did at the running back position. All right, Week 15 running backs was by far my best week of the season. Had a total of 53 running backs that I gave a start or sit designation to. Out of those 53, I got 41 of them correct for an accuracy percentage of 77%. Some of our biggest hits: Joe Mixon, great game against New England. Aaron Jones did Aaron Jones things once again. Adrian Peterson, he was a solid flex for you in Week 15. James White found the end zone again, back to his double-digit scoring self. But some of our misses, there were a couple big ones. First one, Kenyon Drake. By no means did I see 4 rushing touchdowns coming for Kenyon Drake. He was a miss. Miles Sanders, he had his breakout performance here of 2019. He was a miss for us also. I expect a little bit more Boston Scott. Carlos Hyde, he rushed for over 100 yards, and he was a miss for us. And Tony Pollard, that was kind of coming off a few big plays, but a miss nonetheless. But now we're moving forward to Week 16. This is very important, and there's a lot of great matchups for a lot of running backs this week. A lot of guys that I really like the matchups for, so make sure you pay attention to the information. Here we go, talking Week 16 right now. All right, no games on Thursday, but what do we have? A couple games on Saturday. First one we're talking about is going to be the Houston Texans and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, on one side of the football, you have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and possibly one of the worst backfields in all of the NFL. Do you really want to trust Peyton Barber or Ronald Jones during your fantasy playoffs or your fantasy championship? No, I really don't think you want to. I mean, Tampa Bay, they've lost Mike Evans. They've lost Chris Godwin. You would expect more targets going the way of Ronald Jones, and yet, last week, only 3 targets for Ronald Jones. He's still being out-touched on the ground by Peyton Barber. Peyton Barber still stealing touchdowns at times. Yes, Bruce Arians has come out and said that we're going to involve our running backs a little bit more. I feel like I've heard that before. We've heard that all year, and it just hasn't happened. I'm not trusting them now at this point of the season, just too risky. Now for Houston, you have Carlos Hyde, who looked great last week, rushed for over 100 yards, but now he goes up against the defense of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. How good are they? They're tied for first in the NFL, giving up only on average 11.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's tied with the New England Patriots. Hyde is very volume dependent. He needs to have 20-plus touches in order to stay fantasy relevant. Duke Johnson involved at times. He's not consistent enough to trust, but he has stealed some of the goal line work through the passing game. That's kind of where they've utilized him at times this season. Carlos Hyde just isn't somebody that I'm willing to risk it with here in Week 16. He's too volume dependent in a game that I can't guarantee that volume is going to be there. Bills and Patriots up next, and nothing really changes for me for the New England Patriots. James White continues to be the only running back that I will trust on a weekly basis, especially in PPR formats. He's had at least 8 fantasy points in a game, 12 out of the 13 games he's played so far this season. Now, Buffalo, they're playing great. They're a confident team right now, but they've been vulnerable on the ground to running backs. They allow 17.3 fantasy points per game, and we already know that James White is going to be one of the favorite targets of Tom Brady. It also helps White that Edelman is limited right now. It's apparent that he's not 100% healthy. That could lead to more volume going the way of James White, and he really doesn't need the volume to be efficient. He's putting up great numbers on limited touches. He's only had 3 games all year where he's had 12-plus touches. Love the matchup, love the opportunity. Going to start James White again this week. But what about Buffalo? We got Devin Singletary. He's had 4 straight weeks with at least 17 touches. He's ranked top 5 in yards per carry, still at 5.4, and he has a breakaway run percentage of 9.6%. If you don't know what that means almost 10% of his carries result in a carry of at least 15 yards or more. He has big play ability. Now, New England, They only allow 11.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's tied for tops in the league, but they're easier to run on than throw on. Look at last week. Joe Mixon rushed for 136 yards last week on these New England Patriots. They've been vulnerable just as much on the ground as Buffalo has at times. He's more of a solid flex as Devin Singletary this week, but somebody who I'm not avoiding just due to the matchup. Rams and Niners up next, and Todd Gurley owners very thankful that he continues to find the end zone because last week he wasn't going very many places. Only 38 total yards, but found the end zone twice, so it really helped out. That's now 5 touchdowns over his last 5 games. And San Francisco's run D is dealing with some injuries. There's a chance that Richard Sherman comes back, could make it more difficult to throw the ball against San Francisco, resulting maybe in more running plays going the way of Todd Gurley. Now, San Francisco only allows just over 12 fantasy points per game for the season, but maybe they're a little bit more vulnerable now this week. But it all relies on the number 18. And if you don't understand what that means, let me tell you. 18 is really the key here. Ever since the bye week for Todd Gurley, he's been averaging 18 touches a week. When you go and you look at the San Francisco defense, out of all the running backs who have had at least 18 touches against them, all but one of them have finished within, you guessed it, the top 18. The volume has been there. The touchdown upside has been there. I'm still going to start Todd Gurley here this week. Now for San Francisco, it really remains, Raheem, not quite a must-start Mostert, but he's definitely somebody who we're starting on a weekly basis as of right now. He's leading the backfield in touches there for San Francisco. This past week, he had 15 total touches to Matt Breida's 6 and Tevin Coleman's 4. Now, the Rams, they allowed just under 20 fantasy points per game, but they've allowed a couple big games here of late to Mark Ingram and Ezekiel Elliott. Now, no, Raheem Mostert is no Ezekiel Elliott or Mark Ingram, but San Francisco runs the ball 32 times a game. That's second most in the NFL. They're going to continue to lean on the running game, and as of right now, Raheem Mostert, number 1 in the NFL with yards per carry, and number 4 in yards created per carry. What that means is after an evaded tackle, that's how many yards he's getting afterwards. The guy is very elusive. He's making defenders miss, and he's getting up the field. I don't hate Raheem Mostert this week. It's going to be kind of a low-end running back 2 for me here in Week 16. Moving on to Sunday now, the epic showdown of the Bengals and Dolphins, the one you've all been waiting for, said no one ever. But I started Joe Mixon last week against the New England Patriots, so what do you think I'm going to do against the Miami Dolphins? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and start him. The Dolphins allow on average 22.9 fantasy points per game, and Joe Mixon has really come alive as of late. 6 out of his last 7 games have produced at least 15 fantasy points in half-point PPR scoring. He has back-to-back games with 100 yards rushing and at least 26 total touches in each of those games. He may have hurt your fantasy team early. I get it, but he's coming alive at just the right time. I'm going to fire up Joe Mixon once again. For the Dolphins, I still don't dislike Patrick Laird that much. I think he's a pretty safe flex, a safe floor play, a limited ceiling, not somebody you're throwing in there to try to win you your fantasy matchup, but just not lose it for you either. He's had 3 straight weeks of at least 14 touches and 5 targets, so that upside, that pass-catching upside, is going to be there on a weekly basis. Cincinnati gives up, on average, over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Look what we saw James White do against this defense at times last week. He was able to break free for a few big plays. Is that Patrick Laird this week? Possible. A solid flex, a low ceiling, high floor type of play that if you're looking for somebody in a pinch is not a bad option here in Week 16. Steelers and Jets now, and does anybody else out there find themselves closing their eyes every single time James Conner gets tackled? We're expecting him to get hurt, and I hate that because he's one of the more talented running backs in the NFL. Last week only had 12 touches, trying to ease him back into the game flow, but he did find the end zone. So if you had him in your lineup as a late flex, he didn't hurt your fantasy team whatsoever. Tough matchup this week, though, going up against the Jets, who allow only 16.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But this is a must-win game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. There's a chance that they don't have Juju once again. If they don't, they're going to have to heavily rely on James Conner to keep their season alive. Do not be surprised if we see a lot more James Conner in Week 16 than we saw in Week 15. Now, more than likely, you haven't relied on him for your fantasy team since Week 8. Maybe you have other options, and you can continue to throw James Conner as your flex play. that makes him a lot less risky. If those added touches do come, you could be looking at somebody that helps you win your fantasy championship if he can get that extra volume. I'll start James Conner once again this week. Now for the Jets, you have Le'Veon Bell, and it's his lack of passing work that's really keeping his ceiling low. He's been decent. He's been a running back too, but hasn't really put together, back-to-back solid games for quite a while. He's still scoring in double digits, but not what we're used to seeing from Le'Veon Bell. But this could be the revenge game of all revenge games, playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's going to be at home in New York, trying to keep the Steelers out of the playoffs. Maybe they give him a few extra touches, more goal line looks. Maybe once they get into the red zone, they try to force feed him the ball to get him in the end zone to make him kind of play spoiler. He's still had at least 10 fantasy points 5 out of his last 6 weeks. He's more of a mid to low end running back too. A pretty solid defense for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but the revenge narrative, it's real in this one. Giants and Redskins up now, and finally Saquon Barkley arrived. A Miami matchup was just what the doctor ordered last week for Saquon Barkley. The best game of the season, 24 carries, 112 yards rushing, 4 receptions, 31 yards, 2 touchdowns. I mean, a great week for Saquon Barkley against a pretty poor defense, but here's the benefit. He's got another great matchup this week. He's going up against the Washington Redskins, who allow over 21 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the NFL. Perfect timing for those who kind of suffered through Saquon Barkley most of the season. He has a chance to redeem himself here in the fantasy playoffs. Now, for Washington, you have Adrian Peterson. The Giants, they allow over 18 fantasy points per game, and Peterson has 3 straight weeks with at least 14 fantasy points and a touchdown on the ground. I mean, he's going to see close to 20 touches on any given week, and this could be one of those games where he's not really game scripted out. It could be a pretty close game, and they continue to force feed the ball towards Adrian Peterson to take the pressure off of Dwayne Haskins. He's a solid flex with weekly touchdown upside. He may be old, but he's still running hard. I don't dislike Adrian Peterson this week, both him and Barkley in the start column. Panthers and Colts up now, and consider this your weekly reminder that you had a great first-round pick and that you should have no worries that you're going to start Christian McCaffrey. But for Marlon Mack owners, you finally completed that 2-game gauntlet that you had to worry about when he came back off of injury, and now you get a glorious matchup against the Carolina Panthers. How great is it? Well, they give up on average over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Indianapolis should have a lead in this game. They're favored at home. Carolina could be going to rookie quarterback Will Grier. If that's the case, we could see a lot of second half Marlon Mack. If they can get a lead there early, rely more on the running game. We already know Mack was among league leaders in touches before his injury. Definitely somebody who can carry a heavy workload. And I love Marlon Mack again here this week. He could see a lot of volume, and that's what we're trying to find here in the fantasy championships. Ravens and Browns up now, and boy, has a lot changed since these two teams faced back in week 4. Baltimore hadn't really hit their stride yet. Heck, Cleveland still had a chance. In that game, Nick Chubb rushed for 165 yards, had 3 touchdowns, his best game of the year. But don't think that Baltimore has forgotten about that, and they're still playing for something. They're chasing that number 1 overall seed. But Baltimore only allows 16.1 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. However, over the last couple games, they've allowed 100 total yards to 2 out of the last 3 running backs they've faced, Singletary and Mostert. Now, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, they basically are the Cleveland offense at this point. Chubb gets the volume, Hunt more efficient with the touches that he does get. I'm lowering expectations slightly here, but not to the point to where I'm sitting either one of these guys. The volume is going to be there. Both these guys are going to be heavily involved in their game plans every single week. Both Chubb and Hunt remain in the start column. But what about Mark Ingram? I'm going to continue to throw him out there. Do I think that he sees some rest at some point? Possible, but not this week, not unless they get a huge lead. Like I said, they still have something to play for, and I'm going to stick with the uber efficient Mark Ingram once again. Now, if they win this week, just as a quick little side note here, you may want to have Gus Edwards. If you play in week 17, Gus Edwards would definitely be somebody that I go after here quickly. He could be getting the bulk of the work if Baltimore can clinch that number 1 seed here this week. But now, going up against Cleveland, they're allowing over 20 fantasy points per game. And look what they did last week. They made Kenyon Drake look like the LaDainian Tomlinson out there. The guy looked great. I'm going to start Mark Ingram here once again. But if you play in week 17, first of all, I'm sorry. Second of all, go find Gus Edwards. He could be a league winner here in the end. Jags and Falcons up now, and you know how we always talk about the Carolina Panthers and how you want to start your running backs against them? The same can be said for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They give up, on average, over 23 fantasy points per game, second most in the NFL. Now, for Devontae Freeman, yeah, he's disappointed here as of late. He's never really been the same since coming back after his Week 9 bye week. But we've always talked about him as a running back 2, not the running back 1 of years past. And as of right now, in fantasy football, he's running back 24, fringe running back 2s right now. Now, over the last 5 weeks, listen to this stat. Over the last 5 weeks, the Jacksonville Jaguars defense has given up over 730 total yards to opposing running backs. That is a huge, huge number. Nobody really there to take away a whole lot of carries. Devontae Freeman's going to see the bulk of the work in a matchup like this. I'll throw out Freeman once again. Now, for Jacksonville, Leonard Fournette continues to be a solid start. The ceiling has been somewhat lower just because he's not finding the end zone. The Falcons give up on average 17.5 fantasy points per game, but he hasn't had less than 6 targets in a game since Week 7. He's second among running backs right now with 87 total targets. Leonard Fournette racking in the targets this year. Maybe, something we saw in the preseason, but not to this extent. I mean, number 2 overall in running backs. Think about that. The Kamaras, the Ecklers, a lot of these guys that we see a lot of pass, the Christian McCaffreys even, he's number 2 up there with those guys. That's what's keeping this safe floor on a weekly basis for Leonard Fournette. If it wasn't for that and the touchdowns weren't there, there'd be a lot of pissed off Fournette owners. But this added upside in the passing game makes him a weekly start with a safe floor. Saints and Titans up now, and let's be realistic here for a second. Everything I just said about Leonard Fournette can be said about Alvin Kamara also. Lack of touchdowns for both of them. Their involvement in the passing game is what's giving them this safe floor on a weekly basis. The ceiling is just not there. I mean, Alvin Kamara only has 7 carries all season long that go for more than 15 yards. The explosiveness, the big plays, haven't been there this year for Alvin Kamara. Drew Brees out there throwing the ball seems like almost every other time to Michael Thomas, but Alvin Kamara is a safe running back too, which I know you hate to hear because you spent a top 4 pick on the guy more than likely. But you keep him in your lineup. He's a safe, reliable play. The ceiling that you're just hoping for hasn't been there. Keep your fingers crossed. Hopefully he can find the end zone this week and really help your fantasy team. Now on the Titans side of things, Derrick Henry had an okay-ish Week 15. It's kind of sad when 21 carries and 86 yards is a letdown, but it was to a lot of people. He may not practice a whole lot this week, but they really need him to play. This is a must-win game for the Titans. They're going to be playing at home in a difficult matchup against the Saints, who allow only 14 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, what we really need to hope for here as Derrick Henry owners is that the Saints don't come out firing on all cylinders and get an early lead. If they do, Derrick Henry may become a little bit more goal line touchdown dependent, and that volume may decrease slightly. That's not what we want to see for Derrick Henry in our fantasy championships. We want to see this guy getting the ball a lot, and getting those touchdowns opportunities. Keep your fingers crossed. We need a whole lot of Derrick Henry here in Week 16. Raiders and Chargers up now, and Josh Jacobs has earned every piece of respect that I can give the guy. I hate that I doubted him in the preseason. The guy is out there just on a weekly basis, pushing his body to the limits, trying to help out his team. As of right now, 8th in the NFL in carries, 7th in red zone touches, 6th in rushing yards with just over 1,000. He has 13 runs this year over 15 yards. That's second most in the NFL. He's 6th in the NFL in yards created. He has 421 yards after evaded tackles. The guy is not only making people miss, he's also collecting a lot of yards after that missed tackle. And he's doing all of it with a fractured shoulder here second half of the season. The Chargers, they allow right around 20 fantasy points per game, so it's a good matchup. The kid is in pain, though. As long as he plays, as long as he suits up, he's earned the respect to go out there and start in fantasy football lineups because he's playing through the pain every single week, and he's playing pretty well. It's not like he's out there sucking with it. He's actually producing solid numbers with that injury. So as long as he suits up, he's in your lineup. If he does sit, then all of a sudden DeAndre Washington is the name that you want to have in your lineup this week. Now I'm on to the Chargers side of things. I was glad to see Melvin forgot to hold on to the football in Week 15. I mean, what was that all about? 2 fumbles, basically got benched after having 64 total yards for the game. He helped out absolutely no one. Austin Eckler continued to do his thing, though. He now has 6 straight games with at least 11 fantasy points. He has more receiving yards at this point than Christian McCaffrey. Austin Eckler is absolutely killing it. Oakland allows right around 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and I expect both of these guys to see a heavy workload, a heavy volume here once again in Week 16. Both of them finding their way back into the start column once again. Lions and Broncos up now, and there's a chance that Kerryon Johnson returns and plays for the Detroit Lions this week. Why? No idea. He probably shouldn't. Honestly, more than likely, I wouldn't start him this week unless you have no other options. Right now, the Denver Broncos, a top 10 defense against opposing running backs, allowing only 16.5 fantasy points per game. I'm really not wanting to risk it. An outdoor game in December in Denver with a poor rushing team overall doesn't sound ideal, and unless I have no better options, I'm not touching the backfield of the Detroit Lions. Now, for the Denver Broncos, I know a lot of people were let down with Phillip Lindsay last week, but we tried to warn people on the live show that the weather was not ideal there in the snow last week. Neither team could get anything going on the ground. Plus, he was kind of game scripted out in that game. He only had 7 total touches, the fewest amount of touches he's had in a game all season long. But this matchup is so much better. The Detroit Lions give up on average almost 23 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL. Phillip Lindsay is not a must start by any means, but as a solid flex with huge upside. Once again, Phillip Lindsay will find himself in the start column as somebody who has that opportunity to put up some big numbers here in Week 16. Cardinals and Seahawks up next, and apparently Kenyon Drake ate some Wheaties before the game last week. Dude went out and had 22 carries, 137 yards, and 4 touchdowns did Kenyon Drake last week. I mean, that is like the 2019 thing to do, right? Just makes no sense whatsoever. He only has 5 touchdowns on the season. And I just said he had 4 last week. Now, he should continue to get the bulk of the work in this backfield, and Seattle does give up 18.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. The biggest question mark here, can Arizona keep close? If it's a close game, we may see more Kenyon Drake in this game. Is he a must start in that start column? No, he's not. I have him in the sit column, but if you have no better options, maybe you have multiple flex spots, he is somebody to take a stab at. I would not expect the production that you saw last week on a weekly basis by any means. I mean, this was his best game since his first game in Arizona. You never know what's going to happen in that backfield. It's a huge risk on a weekly basis. If you have better options, safer options, I would look there. However, if you're looking for a flex play, Kenyon Drake isn't a horrible option here this week. For Seattle, you have Chris Carson. And one thing that we know is that we're going to see a lot of Chris Carson on a weekly basis. The Seahawks still fighting for that number 1 spot in the NFC, and Chris Carson has seen 20-plus touches 9 times so far this season. The Seahawks run the ball 30 times a game, which is 3rd most in the NFL, and Arizona allows over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, just like he has been almost all season long. Chris Carson in the start column. Cowboys and Eagles in a very critical game trying to fight for a playoff berth, and Zeke just continues to tear it up here second half of the season. Just over his last 2 games, he has 4 touchdowns and a total of 52 fantasy points in half-point PPR scoring. He faced this same Philadelphia defense back in Week 7. How did he do? He had 22 carries for 111 yards and a touchdown. You're not sitting Zeke Elliott ever, and it's about time that the Dallas Cowboys realized they needed to continue to feed Zeke. Now, for Philadelphia, it took 15 weeks, but we finally saw the breakout for Miles Sanders last week, albeit against a pretty poor defense of the Washington Redskins. Now, the Cowboys, they allow right around 17.5 fantasy points per game, a middle-of-the-pack run defense, but right now, Philadelphia is hurting for weapons. 3 straight weeks, Miles Sanders has had at least 18-plus touches. He's had 5 targets in 4 straight games. He's another solid flex option again this week. They're going to have to utilize him here in this game plan. If Jordan Howard sits, which it sounds like he probably will, Boston Scott kind of becomes one of those deep league flex plays if you're looking for somebody. But as of right now, a must-win game for the Philadelphia Eagles. I expect to see a heavy dose once again of Miles Sanders. Last game on Sunday, Chiefs and Bears, and I don't know if there's too many backfields in the NFL that are harder to figure out than these 2 teams. The Kansas City Chiefs, they're keeping LaShawn McCoy and Darwin Thompson to minimal touches at best. David Montgomery is actually getting less efficient as the season goes on, which is mind-boggling since he started off so poorly. In fact, he has single-digit scoring 5 out of his last 6 games. However, both these teams allow right around 18 fantasy points per game. Not horrible matchups, but neither of these backfields are trustworthy at this point. Not in the fantasy championships. If it's me, if it's my team, I'm looking for other options. If I had to choose somebody, it's David Montgomery because the volume is there, but the guy's only averaging right around 3.5 yards per carry. So if he doesn't find the end zone, he's hurting your fantasy team. That is a huge risk if you're willing to take it. Personally, I'm trying to avoid all of these guys in these backfields this week. Packers and Vikings, Monday Night Football. This game is going to be known as the Minnesota Nightmare. Why, you ask? Well, there's already been reports that Dalvin Cook could play through injury. Okay. There's also reports that Alexander Mattison could return from injury. Not ideal. And there's also reports saying that Mike Boone, he's going to be a part of this backfield also. Excuse me? Like, what are we supposed to do? This is a Monday Night Football game. Unless you have multiple players here for the Vikings on your roster, what are you supposed to do? What if you lock in Dalvin Cook? You get all the way to Monday Night Football as a game time decision and they sit him out. You don't have another option to play. And with games playing on Saturday, that only limits the amount of options you may have anyway. This game is almost impossible to figure out at this point of the week. Watch the injury reports, watch the practice reports. Hopefully, one of these guys, 2 of these guys, they can get ruled out ahead of time, so it really makes things a little bit clearer heading into Saturday. If not, this is a huge, huge risk in this backfield and one that you need to know about going into the game. We'll do our best to keep you updated. We'll put out posts here on the community tab on our social medias to try to keep you updated on this backfield because this is something that could really ruin a lot of fantasy outcomes here in Week 16. Now, for Green Bay, you're obviously still going to start Aaron Jones regardless of the matchup. Minnesota, a top 10 defense against running backs, allowing only 16 fantasy points per game. But these two teams faced off back in Week 2. Aaron Jones put up 23 carries, 116 yards, 4 receptions, 34 yards, and a touchdown. His ceiling is just way too high to ever sit Aaron Jones. He's in your lineup. Now, Jamal Williams, he's had 2 straight starts now with only single-digit touches. He's kind of really reduced his work volume here, and they're really relying a little bit more on a weekly basis on Aaron Jones. Lock him into your lineup. Jamal Williams, just somebody that we're kind of going to stash on the bench for right now. I don't see us using him here rest of season. All right, those are my Week 16 starts and sits for the running back position. Hopefully some of that information can be used to help make your decisions this week. Once again, make sure you're following us on Twitter at FNTSY Headliners. Kyle's at KRich1532. Any updates we get on the Minnesota backfield, we will throw it out there on Twitter, on the YouTube community tab, whatever it is. We're going to try to keep you updated. We greatly appreciate that support. If you hear anything out there, if you have any other questions, ask it down below. Myself, another member of Headliner Nation, we really encourage all the other subscribers in this community to get involved with each other. We're not up here telling you that we know more than you or that we're experts and you're not. There are no such thing as fantasy football experts. That doesn't exist. If somebody calls themselves an expert, it's because their work isn't good enough to speak for itself, and they're trying to sell themselves to you. That's not the case over here. We greatly appreciate your support. We're trying to bring home as many championships as we possibly can here to Headliner Nation, and we couldn't do it out without the support of you guys in the community. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your week. Good luck this weekend. We'll talk to you later.